plan should just really set out how you in your museum or organisation are going to identify priorities for your collections care, the activities you may need to take to implement the care and conservation of them, and what resources do you need to do so. So when it comes to the expectation of the accreditation scheme, there's no set template or format for how you set out your care and conservation policy and plan. It should reflect what works best for your own organisation. So, for example, your policy can be a completely separate standalone Word document. You might just have a very simple policy statement, and that might be something that fits within your forward or business plan. Some people like to have their policy sort of preceding the care and conservation plan, so it's all contained within one document, two separate parts, or the policy and the plan can form a part of a separate collections management framework along with your other collections management policies and plans. So it really depends on what works best for you. And that's something that the accreditation assessors will look for as well. They want to see that your policy and plan is appropriate for the size and scale of your museum. So we're very good in this sector at reusing templates and policies and plans from other museums, and the Collections Trust have some really useful examples in their accreditation resources section on their website. But if you do take an example template from elsewhere, that's fine, but just make sure it's appropriate for your own organisation. So there might be some things in there that are not essential or not required for your organisation, or there might be something that's missing. So just don't sort of think, oh, that's all done, that must be how it should be. Really think about how it applies to your own site. The other critical element of the, oh, sorry, I don't know if you can see that on my recording, there we go, I'll get rid of that. The other thing that's really critical as far as accreditation concerned is that your policy must have signed approval from the governing body, and it must be reviewed at least every 5 years. And I've put a link to the accreditation guidance here, and very specifically have a look at page 17 because that's the detail of how signed approval needs to be evidenced from Arts Council. So Arts Council will expect to see either a signature, and it can be a scanned copy of an actual signature, or an identifiable email from an appropriate individual. So it can be traced back to a very specific email to a specific person in your organisation, and they'll want to see evidence on either a copy of the minutes or extract of minutes, or it might be a signed statement, or for local authorities and university museums, it might be evidence in some form of decision document. So do have a look at that guidance on page 17 about signed approval, because I know it is something that has caught a few museums out in the east of England, certainly when they're doing returns. So it's just something to be aware of to save you having any last minute scrambles when you have submitted your return or application and the assessors come back and say, oh, we just need signed approval. You don't have to run around within a short space of time to try and find that evidence, get it sent off. So just a top tip there, make sure you include that. So I'm sure Claire will cover in more detail about the type of things that should be within the care and conservation policy and plan, but I'm just going to very briefly outline the type of things that Arts Council will be looking for when they receive your accreditation application or return. So the policy should cover how the care and conservation of collections links back to the museum statement of purpose. They want to see that there is a long-term commitment to the preservation of collections. They want your policy to consider both remedial and preventative conservation, and that you address your commitment to ethical and legal responsibilities, and that may tie in to specific reference to any specialist collections that you hold as well. So think about that. That goes back to being very specific to your organisation. They'll also want to see if you use any relevance and standards and frameworks that you might use when it comes to collections policies and plans. So you might use benchmarks in collections care. I've put a link to that there, and that's, if you're not familiar with it, it's a really useful self-assessment tool that can help when it comes to planning your collections care and conservation. And if you do use something like that or benchmarks, that should really be referenced in your policy. Arts Council also want to see how you access expert conservation and collections care advice. So that might be through training, it might be through contacting Spencer and Fry. I know in the East and South East, and I think in London as well, we have some one-to-one virtual surgeries, so you can access advice that way. Your first point of contact might be your local museum development team who can help you or signpost you to somewhere else, or it might be through freelance conservators. And you may have conservators that you work with, or you may have in-house conservators. And I've just put a link there to the ICON register for finding a conservator if you are sort of starting from scratch and don't quite know how to go about it. It's a good way to start. Arts Council also want to see how you communicate your policy to staff, volunteers, contractors and users. So is it part of the induction process? Is it made available to new starters, whether they're staff or volunteers? Do contractors have access to it when they're working on site with or near collections? And perhaps you have it on your website so that users who might be interested can have a look as well. So some people do that. So it's just about thinking how you make that policy sort of a live document, as it were, that people can access and see. When it comes to the care and conservation plan, you might start off with an overview of your current collections care. You might have a paragraph or two about that, and then it really needs to go into what you are going to do and how you are going to do it. So it is a working document, your care and conservation plan. And again, you can set it out however you want. So you might have a Word document with text. You might have an action plan with tabular or grid. Some people use spreadsheets, an Excel spreadsheet. But it's what works for you and what's manageable for you. So as I say, it is a working document. And you should be using it to establish priorities and think about mitigating risk. You also need to think about what resources you have available to implement your plan, and whether you need any additional resources. So will you have to look for additional funding? And I think this is where it's really important to think about the scale of your priorities and what they might be. So it might be something quite simple and low cost. You need some insect blunder traps, an acid-free tissue paper, or it might be that your store has a hole in the roof and you're going to need some capital funding or something quite major. So it can have quite a big impact. And Arts Council will also look at your budgeting for your care and conservation as well. I always think it's good to be ambitious, but I also think it's really important to be realistic as well. So I would say that while your policy might be reviewed every 5 years, it might be more practical to do a plan, say, for 3 years, so that you can update and reflect on progress and adapt and make changes if necessary. And Arts Council will be looking to see that your plan is realistic and it is achievable. So accreditation requirements do vary slightly, so it is scalable and it will depend on what type of museum you are. And again, I've popped another link to the guidance in here just to make sure you can get to it, but it does outline the different types of 3 different types of museum, which is dependent on your workforce, whether you're paid or volunteer staff, number of visitors, operating budgets, that kind of thing. So the requirements for accreditation are sort of standard remain the same, but the amount of information that you need to supply is scalable. So it'll be very different if you're a national museum to if you're a small local volunteer run museum. So just have a look at the guidance about what level you will need to sort of put into your plan. So finally, I always say accreditation isn't about perfection. It's about improving and ensuring longevity and sustainability. So Arts Council will be looking for that within your care and conservation policy and plan. They will want to see that you are thinking about long-term progress and improvements, that you've identified priority areas, that your plan is appropriate for your size and type of museum, and they'll be looking to see how you access that more specialist advice if you need it. I also just wanted to say that when it comes to uploading your application or return to Arts Council, your care and conservation policy is mandatory. You have to supply a copy. Your care and conservation plan has to be available on request. but you still need to do it, and you still need to have it, because it's highly possible that you might be the museum that Arts Councils suddenly asks, oh, can we have a look at that, please? And you will be expected to supply it, so don't get caught out. I just want to say, don't forget you're not alone. There's always lots of advice and support available from your friendly museum development team. We can either help, or we can signpost you to somebody who can help. And I just wanted to finish off by saying your policies and plans should be useful for you, and they're not just a tick box exercise for accreditation. So you know, don't do all that hard work writing the policies and plans and then stick them in a drawer until your next accreditation return. They should be active, and they should be useful. So that's kind of me finished. I don't know if we've got any questions in the chat. I can't see, so I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see my chat and see if we've got any questions now. I know Claire is going to have some questions. So I think, unless there's anything burning, I think I will hand over to Claire, and then if anybody has any questions, we can do that at the end.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Right, the moment I always try and hope that my screen share works. So my laptop is old and struggling. Hannah, I can see you on camera. Can you see my screen? Perfect, thank you. So I'm just going to put up chat as well, just so I can see if anyone has any burning questions as we're going through. So good morning, everybody. It's Friday, so hooray. I don't know if anybody else out there is feeling it like me, but I'm really glad it's almost the weekend. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail first about the oh, no, we're not. So we're going to talk a little bit more detail about collection care policies and plans. But first, I just want to remind everybody about what conservation is about. So I should say I'm a conservator. My specialism is preventive conservation. I think I've spoken to some of you, or emailed some of you, or been in contact doing surgeries, or maybe visits. So as a conservator, I recognise that conservation is defined as the careful management of change, and it's about revealing and sharing the significance of places and ensuring that their special qualities are protected, enhanced and understood and enjoyed by present and future generations. So that is something from the National Trust, and the Institute of Conservation goes on and also defines conservation as the purpose of all conservation is to facilitate the public's access to and enjoyment of our cultural heritage. So conservation isn't about locking collections away in a dark room and not letting anyone see them, so we're going to preserve them forever. It's a real balancing act between access, enjoyment, enhancement, investigation, and trying to mitigate the risks as best we can. So your collection care policy is not everything must be preserved at all costs. It's about how the collections can be preserved whilst giving access and allowing them to meet the aims of your museum. So thinking first a bit about the conservation and collections care policy. So exactly as Hannah said, it needs to fit with the statement and purpose and key aims of your museum. So when we do preventive conservation audits, quite often we go to museums, we ask if we can see the policy, and sometimes we get the template printed out, and I know that they've printed out the template because it says insert museum name here, and it still says insert museum name here. So it's really important you actually think about why are we doing this? Why is Arts Council asking you to write the collection care policy? So what I want you to do now, if possible, is I'd like you to spend just a few minutes really thinking about why your museum should care for your collections. Why should you carry out conservation? Initially, it sounds really obvious. Well, we're a museum, it's what we should do. But I would just like you to think, why is it important to your museum that your collections are in good condition? So if you can just spend a couple of minutes thinking about that, then I'm going to ask if people feel brave enough to share some of their thoughts in the chat. So if you could do that, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay, great. So I'm going to start reading out some of the responses. So to look after objects for the future, yep. To preserve collections for future generations to enjoy, yep. I would say current generations also. Public duty of care, expectation of donors, yep, that's a really important one. So that as many objects as possible have the potential for use in exhibitions and other engagement activities. Yep, good point. Some of our collection is unique, so very important to conserve. Ensure objects and archives can be enjoyed in their original state for as long as possible. Absolutely, Dawn. Some artifacts will deteriorate if left unattended. This is true. Many of our larger items are aircraft, some of which are kept outdoors. That is a tricky one. I think, Alistair, we're coming to see you in August, so we can have a look at that. We're also doing a project with the RAF Museum at the moment, so similar issues. To tell the story of people's lives and the past. That's a good one, Barbara. So the object's cultural value is sustained. Without a collection, we have no museum. Yep. Future generations will have no link to the past. As a small town museum, it's important for us to use and keep and maintain the history of Whitney. That's great. Collections can tell a story of the past, can be individual objects or a whole collection. Paintings, furniture, tapestries that can be educational and engaging for the public. Great. Yes. So there's some really good points there. So I think it's just important to remember that this isn't something just to do for accreditation, that you think about this in the context of your collection and how important it is to you as a museum. So some thoughts that I just put together sort of yesterday are exactly as you said. You might have a rare survival, the last example of something or other, or there's only 10 left in the world, and it's really important that we look after that. Improve interpretation. So if an object's in good condition, it's going to be easier for the visitors to see what it is, how it was used, how it worked. This can improve the visitor experience. The object might tell a story, and I think someone put that in the chat. And that's a really important message, the story for your museum. The objects might represent communities, either your local community like Whitney or a different kind of community. And it's about a respect for looking after the objects that they've given to the museum. It might be that you hold objects that are important for research. So people want to come and use them for historical research or carry out scientific investigations. And if they're in good condition, that will allow that to happen. As somebody, I can't remember who, said in the chat, it may be that you have loan objects and you want to keep those loan objects. So you want to prove to lenders that you're looking after those collections. Or it might be that you want to put on temporary exhibitions. So it's really important you can prove to lenders that you have good systems in place to look after what you hold in the museum. Support educational materials and activities. So it might be collections in good condition can be handled or touched, or it might be that you've got an object in working order, so that has educational properties. It's a bit about institutional reputation. You don't want to be known as a museum that, you know, object deteriorated, you lost something or something was stolen. Having a collection in good condition can support commercial activities, maybe because your museum is, everything looks so fantastic that people want to use it, you know, to rent out spaces, or it might be that the collection can be used to generate income. So I'm thinking of things like Little Green, using museum collections to recreate historic wallpaper, and then you know, sort of selling that and and paying the museum for that honor of replicating their collection items. Having good collection care can reduce the cost of future conservation, and maybe not so much for museums, but for some of our private clients, some of their objects are incredibly financially valuable and they want to make sure that they stay valuable. So there's just a few things about why we're doing this. So it's not just for accreditation, it's not just because we should, that there's lots of really good reasons for this running of the museum in all different areas that we care for the collections. The other thing about policy is that it makes a difference between remedial and preventive conservation, preventative. See, I can't even say it, that's why I say preventive. Are two different types of conservation. So just to clarify that remedial conservation is really where it's kind of interacting physically with the object. So it can be from a small repair to restoration. And some people think that restoration is bad, but it's quite nuanced. So sometimes some level of restoration is ethically acceptable. And then we have preventive conservation, which is to maintain the condition of object and try and manage deterioration as best we can. As Hannah said, we can't keep everything forever. Sort of natural state of things is that they do decay over time, but we can try and reduce this as best as possible, balancing that with access and enjoyment of our collections. So there is a picture of a teacup here for two reasons. The first is that I realize there's been lots of words on screen when we're talking about collections. So here's a collection object from the V&A. And I was going to say at this point we could take a break, but we are ahead of schedule. So if everyone is happy, I think what we can do is carry on maybe for another 20 minutes and then take a break. If Hannah, Amy, Helen, you just want to put a thumbs up if you think that's okay. Great, okay. So we're not going to take a break, so please ignore that. So sorry about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the plan, and then we will have 10 minutes comfort break. But I think we'll get started on that before we go off for our cup of tea. So in the guidance, it does say that your plan can be proportionate. So if you're a small museum, I don't think the Arts Council are expecting you to have the latest, most high-tech environmental monitoring and really quite sophisticated control methods if that's not suitable for your museum. It also has to be appropriate for the types of material that you have in your collections. So there's no point having a whole section on how you're going to manage light levels and try and reduce light levels if you are a museum that only has ceramics, because it's not really appropriate and it's not where you need to be prioritizing your resources. So it really is worth thinking about what you have and where you need to sort of apply, prioritize. One size does not fit all. So as Hannah said, there are templates for these plans on Southwest Museum Development that you could use as a starting point. But if you do, it's really crucial that you tailor those to be specific to your museum. So as I said, sometimes I've seen people have just printed out the template, which is great that they've got a policy, but actually it would be so much better if they've actually tailored that policy so it is a tool for their museum, not just, as Hannah said, something to tick a box for accreditation. So a good way to start to think about what you're going to put in your plan is to carry some kind of audit out or review of what you have and where you are currently with your collections care conservation. So there's different ways you can do this. The first is that you can get a conservation audit or collections care plan written for your museum. So the Museum Development agencies represented here today, so Share Museum Development London and Southeast Museum Development can arrange these audits for you through Spencer and Fry, or AIM also gives grants to have collection care plans written for your museum. So that can be a good way to start. If you want to do it in-house, there are benchmarks, as Hannah said, and I'll show you an example of this. And there's also the risk awareness profiling tool. So these are just tools you can use to have a quick snapshot of where you currently stand with your collections care and conservation. During this process, you can also identify objects that are particularly vulnerable, or things like special collections. So I think in the guidance, it talks about something like working collections. So where you might need to take a sort of individual approach to that. It might be that you have firearms or human remains, and then there's certain specific ethical considerations for that. So this is a good time to think about what's in your collection and if there's anything that needs specific measures. It's also a good time to identify hazards. So hazard flagging, I think it started to be called, is sort of a real growing area now, where people are realizing that their collections have asbestos, mercury, poisons, radioactive elements, and it's really important that you can identify these and be aware of these. And if you have any concerns about this, then you can contact us and we can point you in the right direction. There's also the excellent hazards poster that Share have on their website, so that can be used as well to start thinking about that. So this is an example of benchmarks. So it is free. You can get it from the National Conservation Service website, or it's also, there's a link for it on Collections Trust. And you go through several different areas and you look for each standard, you say if that's been met, partly met or not met, and you go through good practice and then best practice. And at the end, it gives you a bit of a snapshot of where you are. So this is great, it's free, but you can modify it. So sometimes we get people phoning us up in a panic saying there's lots about digitization, we don't do that, what should we do? But actually digitization isn't applicable for their collection. So if that's the case, just ignore that section and move on. There's also quite a lot of referencing to European or British standards. So if you get stuck on that point, you can either just not worry about it, or again, you can contact maybe your MDO or us and we can tell you a bit more about what that standard entails. There's also the risk awareness profiling tool. I personally haven't used this, but this is another free, as I understand it, tool that can be used to, again, profile risk in your museum and think about where you are with collections care. So let's go into more detail about what could be in the collections care plan. So the first area that's talked about in the guidance is your buildings. And although we're talking about collections, the building really is your first line of defense against the elements and caring for your collections inside. Quite often we get called in because people are concerned that humidity is high, and when we get there, it's actually a building issue that's causing the problem. So the humidity might be high because something like the gutter is broken, there's water coming in. So the first piece of advice we'd give, or the first action that you might identify for your collection care plan, is that we need to repair the building, or we need to carry out some maintenance on the building. And I appreciate that is a really easy thing for me to say sat here, but actually it can mean going for a grant. It might be you don't own your building. It's actually managed by the council or someone else. So I appreciate it's not a simple thing, but I would argue, and in fact, I've seen in the past, that if you have a really good collections care conservation policy and plan where you say these objects are really important and this is why we need to look after them, and we've identified that a real risk to them is the fact the gut is broken and water's coming in, that actually can help with the argument that somebody needs to invest some money to repair the guttering or fix the roof or increase drainage so the museum doesn't flood, or the church. Or I've been looking at where you're all from during the break, some really fabulous places. So the first part is to think about your building. Is it providing what we call a good envelope for caring for your collections inside? So the action plan might be to repair, to maintain. Really useful thing, I keep on going on about it, is just clearing gutters so that they don't fill up with leaves back up, and then you have water ingress coming in and getting your collections wet. The next section that the guidance talks about is environmental conditions. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what that could mean and what could go in your action plan. So the first one I'm going to talk about is light. And light, in some ways, I think is one of the worst agents of deterioration, as conservators tend to call them, because you need light to see the collections, but the damage that's caused by light is irreversible, and all light damage is cumulative. So every time there's some light on your object, it's going to fade a little bit. And this obviously is not an object, it's a leaflet from a museum, but I just thought it's a great example of an example of light damage. So I don't know if there's anybody here from West Berkshire Heritage, but you can see that this was a pile of leaflets left on a windowsill. The top one got a lot of daylight. So not only do we have fading, but we've also got colour change. So if you can see the 3 blocks to the left where it says West Berkshire Heritage, the bottom one used to be green, but presumably because the yellow pigment would have been organic, it's faded and it's just left the blue inorganic pigment. So light just doesn't only cause fading, but it can change the colours of things. And that's why quite often you'll see tapestries where the trees are blue and you think that's odd, but it's because the yellow's gone, just leaving the blue. Light also can change colours of other materials. So wood, it can fade, or in the slide on the right, you can see where the cupboard door's been opened. This Gillows piece of furniture would have been beautiful red and yellow, but the sun's made it all just sort of a uniform orange. And light damage can cause physical damage. So this is an example of 2 silk objects that have been facing a window, and the light has caused the silk to shatter. So sort of complete destruction of those objects. So what can we do about light? What might we think about having in our plan that could help with this? So the first sort of thing is that there's 2 parts of light that we're concerned about, and the first is UV. So it might be that if you haven't got already, you might consider putting UV film on your windows. The slide on the left just shows UV coming up through this window. It's 218 microwatts per lumen. We put the film over, it's just taken all the UV out. So that is a quite simple thing to do to really reduce risk to your collection. However, it's not always that cheap, but that's something that you might consider doing. You might also want to think about visible light. This also causes problems for collections. So do you have light control? Do you have sunlight falling directly on objects? Could you install a blind? There's traditional blinds like on the left, or there is these univision blinds now that you can see through, but they do reduce light levels. So is this something you might want to consider to manage the problem of light in your museum? You might want to cover objects, so you can't control light as a whole, but individual objects can be covered. Or you might think about how long things are on display. So if you know something's light sensitive, a watercolor, print, a book, you might think we'll put it on display for 6 months, then we'll swap it out for another collection item that could replace it in that display. So having changing exhibitions might be something that you consider to manage this risk. You can also measure light damage. So on the right is quite standard. Blue wall dosimeter. So these are fairly cheap. You can put them out and you can just measure how much light is falling on collection items by how faded the standard blue wool gets. Or the Canadian Conservation Institute now have brought out this whole interactive website where you can put in the light levels that you expect to fall on an object, what kind of material it is, and then it would tell you how much that colour is going to change over different amount of years, or with different mitigation measures in place. So some people now are using this to guide how long they'll put objects out on display and changing their temporary exhibitions based on that. Light doesn't always obviously come from outside. We can have artificial light sources. So one thing that a lot of museums are doing now, or they've identified in their plan, is that they're going to change artificial light sources from halogen or tungsten or fluorescent to LED. This is great because LED doesn't have any UV and it has minimal heat output. So one museum we were at recently, we could smell burning, and we tracked it down to a halogen light that was on top of one of their cases. So a simple thing of just when light bulb fails, you replace it with an LED light bulb. Might be a really good collection care measure that you can think about, put in your plan, and then roll out as and when you need to. So the example on the right is just of people of somewhere that had put in new case lighting, and this was fluorescent light, and it was really getting hot. So that was a bit of concern for various reasons. And then the picture on the left is sunlight coming through a window, and we are measuring about 30 degrees on the surface of that painting. So this sort of leads me on to another area that we might want to think about in your plan, and that is temperature, which can then have effect on relative humidity. So This is another area of environmental conditions that you should consider for your plan. So we know that if the humidity is high, we can get corrosion, we can get mold. If the humidity fluctuates, we can get things like veneers cracking off or warping, like we can see in this table on the top. So how we control relative humidity is a big thing, obviously, for a lot of us. So the first thing I'd say about that is people quite often want to jump in and sort of say, oh, I think we're a bit damp, let's put in dehumidifiers, let's put in heaters. But I think the first step you should do if you're thinking about your environment is to start some monitoring, because it's really difficult to modify something or change something if you don't know what's happening in the first place. I would also say buying a few data loggers and putting them around your museum will not fix all the problems. And this sounds really patronizing, but it's just to remind people, if you put in your plan that you're going to start monitoring, you also need to put in the plan that someone is going to download that data or look at that data and review what is happening. So it's a bit like going to the doctor and having a load of tests and then never getting the results. You know, you've put out this machines to collect information, so it's really important then that you look at that information that's recorded and act on it. There is going to be another training session on environmental monitoring and control, so if this is something that you think you might want to develop further, then that is a session sort of similar to this session that you can think about attending. So I would say if you identify in your plan you think humidity could be a bit of an issue, then ideally you would start monitoring first, ideally for a whole year, so you can get a real sense of what's happening. And then at that point, once you understand what's going on, you can start to bring in control measures. So this might be additional heating, dehumidification, humidification. You might know that you've got a particularly vulnerable object, and you might decide that actually the best thing for that is to put it in a display case and create a microclimate around it. So moving on to insect pests. So insect pest management is giving in the guidance as something that you should consider for your plan. So we have moths on the left and beetles on the right. And I'm pretty sure that every single person in this chat has had to deal with some kind of infestation at some point, because everyone has bugs at some point, or probably, if we're quite honest, quite a lot of the time. There's been quite a few bad moth years, I think, recently. So we've been called in because lots of people are having webbing or case-bearing clothes moth. So again, this is something in your collection care plan, if you identify it's a bit of an issue, that you can think about actions you can put in to deal with this. And I would say for all these things that I'm talking about at the moment, they're not all mutually exclusive and they all overlap. So if you can control your environment, there's less chance bugs don't like it dry. So if you've got lots of damp conditions, it might be that this is increasing your risk of infestation. So all these should be sort of done in conjunction, and all these should be done at the same time as looking at your collection. So you know, if you can monitor the environment, but it's also worth checking your collection as well. Are you seeing mold? Are you seeing corrosion? Are you having a look to make sure that there's no moth nestled in that textile that's all packed up nicely in your store? So these should all sort of be done and thought about together because they all overlap. So what can we do for insect pests? What might we think about putting in for our plan? Well, monitoring again is a really good way to start. So it might be that you have blunder traps in your museum or pheromone moth traps, and you can really start seeing what's happening. This can be used to identify infestations maybe before you do see them, and you can use these to help pinpoint where the infestation is coming from. It's really useful if people in your museum, church, historic house know the pests that can cause problems. So this is the English Heritage Pest Poster. There's actually a new version out now. So quite a lot of places I go to have this in their tea room, which I don't know, it's a bit grim, having a cup of tea and eating your biscuit, and there you are looking at biscuit beetle. But it's really useful to know that, do you know what, that moth is just a moth, it's not a problem, or oh, crumbs, that's a webbing clothes moth, we're going to have some issues, we need to take some action because this could be a bit of a problem. But even if you do have bugs in your museum that aren't are going to eat your collection, it's good to have regular cleaning and get those bugs up, because there's nothing more an insect likes to eat than another insect. So this is why I thought it'd be good to have your coffee before this, or your biscuit, because this is a beetle that's been caught on a monitor, a pest monitor, and inside that beetle we can see a woolly bear, which is the larvae of a carpet beetle eating the beetle. So that carpet beetle has found that beetle, it's eating that. Once it's done with that, then it will probably go off to eat your collection. So having good regular cleaning is really key to keeping on top of insect infestations, and checking what's coming into your museum. So if someone donates an object, even if you get a loan object in or temporary exhibition, it's worth just double checking that there aren't any stowaways on that collection that then could start to infest your museum, church, historic house. It might be something also going back to buildings. If you have chimneys, quite often there's bird nests in the chimneys, they get caught or birds die in them. So beetles go in to eat what's ever in the nest or the dead birds, and then they drop down your chimney and start to infest your collection. So if you do have chimneys, putting regular chimney cleaning on your plan is something that would be very beneficial. So moving on to cleaning, we've said cleaning is key to keeping down insect pests. Cleaning is obviously also really important for removing dust from your collection. Dust is not good. It can be hygroscopic, it can scratch, it can contain chemicals that can react with objects. So we want to remove this from collections, and how you go about that would also be a key part of your plan. You might think about how you can reduce dust coming in. So it might be about the gravel outside. Can you replace with different gravel? Can you shut the windows if you're by a busy road or you have gravel outside? Can you put good matting in so you're removing a lot of dust coming in with visitors at the entrance? And then how you clean is really important. So this is an object that somebody has seen that there's metal elements, and they've thought, oh, a bit of brass will be great at bringing those up. But what they've done is they've taken off the patina from the wood, and brasso is actually not very good for brass. I don't know if, John, you might have to cut that bit out if that's going on YouTube, that I've just said something really bad about a named product. But we can see the residue around that. So someone, not intentionally, but the best will in the world, they've gone in and actually they've used the wrong product and caused a bit of damage to that object. So if you want to clean an object you're not quite sure, please feel free. I think I can say this. If you need some help, to talk to your MDO or talk to Spencer and Fry, and we can help you with that. The National Trust Manual of Housekeeping is also a really useful source of information. And there's guides on how to care for things through ICON, the Institute of Conservation website. So if you're not sure, ask or seek some recommendations about what is the appropriate way to clean an object. Also, frequency of cleaning is really important. So for insect pest management and to remove dust, it's important that you do clean regularly, but we don't clean too much. So this is just an object where it's been lovingly polished time and time again, and they've actually taken off the silver plating. And then I just really love this story that was in a newspaper, because I hope one day someone gives me a ceramic that's worth £92,000. But the slightly sad thing was that this cleaner had cleaned it so much that she'd rubbed off all the enamel. So although it sold at auction at £92,000, it probably would have been worth more than £1 million had she not done that. So cleaning is important, but the way we do it and how often we do it is also really important. So that might be something in your action plan to review, to start a schedule, or to start to write cleaning guidance for specific objects. There's also a time where you might want to take cleaning sort of the next level. So it's worth thinking about what cleaning can be done in-house and when you might need to contact a conservator to come and clean an object, sort of to wet clean, or to give it sort of a clean that's a bit more than a dust. Inspection. So this is sort of looking at your collection. As I've mentioned, that's a really important thing to do. Cleaning is a really good time to sort of get up close and personal, and you might see if there's change, you might see if there's a few holes in there and evidence of moth infestation, you might see that there's start of mold. So ideally you would think about scheduling in regular checks of different parts of your collection. And if you had a certain material that you're particularly concerned about, it might be that you ask a conservator to come and do a survey, and they can identify anything that's unstable and help prioritise any conservation treatment that's required. So now moving on to think a bit about storage and display. So there are some threats or agents of deterioration you might want to consider. So the first is physical forces. So this can be a direct one-off, like the table getting a whack on the right-hand side, or just wear and tear, like the carpet, where people have just walked over it time and time again, and it's starting to wear out. So are your objects protected? Do you need to stanchion something off? Does something need to go in a display case? Are there objects that people can get close to and that's not a problem? Are your objects mounted so they're fully supported? So that's another area to consider. And again, benchmarks or the online risk assessment tool can help you with that. Touching is a big thing. So this was just an exercise that English Heritage did when they reopened Elton Palace, and they wanted people to have the opportunity to touch all the different materials that were part of the new display, but they didn't want them to touch the real ones, so they gave them an opportunity to touch them on this board, but they covered half to show that what the cumulative effect of people touching materials would have. So the cotton polyester we can see has got really dirty, and the silk has just been completely destroyed by that constant touch. Saying that, there is a movement now that actually for people to enjoy and interact with collections, they should be given the opportunity to interact with collections and maybe touch some parts of the object, parts of the collection, and that people with certain disabilities benefit from touching collections. So there might just be an identification of some types of material that you think touching is not a good idea, and then some parts of the collections where they might be able to be handled or people can touch them. The other part of display and storage is we need to think about what materials we are using to display our collection items or store our collection items, because materials can give out pollutants that will have a detrimental effect on collections. So things like silver being displayed with wool, the wool gives out sulfides. This reacts with the silver to make silver sulfide, which is tarnish. The example on the left here is a lead object. It's part of a stained glass window. It's been put in a display case that's made of wood. Acids are coming out of the wood. It's reacting with the lead to make it corrode. And then on the right, so it's not sort of display, it's actually the object destroying itself. But when two metals touch each other, you can get this galvanic corrosion where you get quite impressive corrosion quite quickly. So I see this quite a lot where people have put coins on pins, and the metal of the pin has reacted with the metal of the coin, and quite rapid and destructive corrosion has occurred. So it's just as simple as putting a bit of plastic on your pin so those two metals aren't touching. So in your collection, is everything displayed with materials that aren't going to adversely affect it? And in store as well, are using archival boxes to keep your collection packed up. Things aren't wrapped up in bubble wrap. So you're sort of thinking about museum standard packing. So this is just an example of what I think is quite good storage. So things aren't, on top of each other, or the store's not being used to store non-collection items. And when things are packed up, they're packed up, so they're fully supported in correct materials. So this isn't part of the guidance. So I'm looking at Hannah now to see if I'm slightly going to get in trouble for this. But this is covered, I guess, by sort of emergency planning in the accreditation scheme. But for the care of your collections, you may take this opportunity and have in your plan measures for security. So you're making sure that you are keeping your collection as safe as you can. You might think about security for vandalism. So people aren't knocking your objects or writing on your objects. Or you might think a bit about how you could protect your objects if people want to use them to make a protest. You might just want to make sure that you reference emergency planning. So what are you doing for that aspect as a sort of overall collection care sort of overview. So thinking about your collection care plan, and I've looked at quite a few. If you want to have a look at a few examples, if you Google collection care conservation policies and plans, there are quite a few museums who have put theirs on the internet, so you can have a look what other museums have done. And as Hannah said, quite a few finish with a kind of set of actions. And that, I think, makes the plan a really useful tool. So it's not just saying, yep, we're going to look after the environment. It's saying actually what you are going to do to achieve those measures. So I don't know if this is a bit old-fashioned now, but the acronym SMART is quite useful. So when you're thinking about actions, are they specific? Are they measurable? Are they actually attainable? Are they relevant to what you want to do? And is there a time scale to go with them? So it's quite clear to when you're putting in for accreditation that you have a task that's very clearly defined, but it's also easier for you to measure actually how you're doing with this and make sure that these things get done. And the other thing I would add is who is going to who is responsible for this, because in my experience, if you don't make somebody responsible, it doesn't really happen. But if you name someone and it's in their forward job plan, then it's much more likely to get done. I'm just going to have a look. Sorry, a few things have come up in chat. So is bubble wrap damaging? Should it not be used? And there's a response. It can leave pattern of the bubble on the object. It is better to put a layer of acid-free paper in between. Yes, fantastic, actually. So thank you. That's been answered in the chat. So the plasticizer from bubble wrap can leach out over time as it breaks down. So exactly as Antia, I hope I said that correctly, says, sometimes you get an impression of the bubbles as the plasticizer leaches out. So ideally something like acid-free tissue would be put around an object full time. So thank you, that's been answered already. And the final thing that I was just going to touch on was thinking about resources. And as Hannah said, it's great to be ambitious, but also you really need to think about, can you deliver what you want to? So it might be that you have to scale back and say, do you know what, we'd love to do this all the next 2 years, but we don't have enough staff time to do this. We don't have enough budget to do this. So we're going to prioritize these 4 actions for the next 2 years, and then we will hopefully within 5 years achieve everything that's in our top 10 actions. Or it might be that you can use this plan to argue for more resources. So I do know one museum where they have gone through this process and they have gone to their trustees and said, we really need to do these actions, and actually we need another post to help us do this. So they've argued that they needed an assistant curator to come in and help them. Or it might be that you use this to apply for a grant so you can get more budget to carry out some of these actions. And the guidance also asks about how you will use freelance conservators, or if you would have conservation resources in-house. And just to put out a bit of a plea that conservation is a bit harder than it looks. So this is what happens. Well, it's a bit mean really, but this is what happened when one person decided to give it a go themselves. So I would always advocate that you go for an experienced, trained, preferably accredited conservator. So they will have had years of training. They have gone through a process where they prove that they have the skills and expertise to carry out the type of conservation that they are accredited for, but also that they abide by a set of ethics and a code of conduct that means that they will approach the object in an ethical way and only carry out treatment that is appropriate. And if you want to find a conservator, this is being revamped at the moment, but this is the Institute of Conservation's Conservation Register. So you can go on there and look for the material that you need conservation advice for and see, hopefully it will tell you who's near you that can help with that. Or if you do have an object where you need conservation advice, you can talk to your MDO, or please feel free to come and talk to Spencer and Fry. We don't carry out conservation treatments, but we do know lots of people who do, so we can always recommend a few people to you if you are stuck. So I was going to say any questions then, but I think what we're going to do is we've got about 40 minutes left, so I think I'd just like to get you all thinking for a little bit about plans, and then perhaps, if you agree, Hannah, we'll finish with a good question and answer session. I can see Hannah nodding. So what I want you all to do is just think about, when I was going through that, if anything sort of resonated with you and you thought, oh, that's in our museum, that might be a bit of an issue. And I want you to just think about that one area and just think about actions that you could implement to improve or reduce the risk. So if you could just take a couple of minutes just to think about that, and if you want to start putting them in the chat, then that would be great. So just the area you think could be a concern for your museum, or it might be you think you need to carry out benchmarks first, or have an audit, or do some risk assessment tool to try and identify your risks. But what sort of actions you think immediately that you could implement in your museum, church, historic house? So while everyone's still thinking about their areas of risk, I'm just going to try and answer Christina's question. So how often should you change UV film? So usually the standard given is around every 10 years. However, it really depends on the orientation that it's facing. So south-facing windows tend to deteriorate quicker because the UV film absorbs UV and then that ultimately breaks it down. So ideally, if you have a UV meter, you can just go around checking the UV film. I know some properties where they've had their UV film on for 17, 18 years and it's still going strong, and some properties where they've started to notice their UV film failing after about 6, 7 years. So it would be good to measure it if you can, but I would probably, if you're thinking about budget, think about every 10 years. Ideally, you would replace your UV film. Finally, what is the best non-visual sign to deter visitors from not touching? Like Amy, yep, that's a good idea. So I don't know, this is like the eternal question of pine cones, teasels, ropes. So I've seen nice sort of ropes used quite effectively, but I'm not quite sure how they translate. I did see an amazing historic house where I saw some woman walking along and she had a teasel stuck to the back of her skirt. So obviously she sat on that chair and the teasel got stuck to her. So that's the photo I really wish I'd got. So you don't want to, in fact, actually, Amy, I think you're right. So what we could do now is people can raise their hands. So if you go to the bottom of the screen, and you can see reactions, which is by a little smiley face, you can press that and then press your hand up. So if people do that and then want to ask a question, they can do that verbally. You can still put questions in the chat as well if you want. So so Christina, I'll think about non-touching, but if anybody else has any good ideas of way they've done discrete please don't touch this signs, then please feel free to add in your thoughts. I do quite like, there's a museum near me in Luton and it just has a little sign on saying, I'm old and fragile, please don't touch me. So that's quite sweet. So if anybody wants to put their hands up if they want to ask a question, please do. If not, I'm going to carry on reading out some of the things on chat. So 2 paintings and 1 large wooden clock on open display in a museum gallery, which isn't monitored by staff. Actions: install motion sensor alarm to put people off touching. Yep. Maintain regular dusting. Check that ceiling lights are LEDs. Fantastic that the case lights have already been changed over. So that all sounds really good. That is a good point as well. So motion sensors. So I know at Apsley House we put one in around the Silver centerpiece, so it's just proximity alarms. If someone puts their hand out to touch it, the alarm goes off. I have to make sure they don't jump and knock anything, but that is a good idea. We've recently acquired 1,000-year-old timber from Raleigh Castle. Oh, hello. Oh, Helen, is that you? Did you want to say something?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. One timber is too large for the museum. Extremely strong. It's currently in our storage unit, but conditions are not ideal. We should place bug traps around it and protect from light and make sure it's well supported. Can we do more? I don't probably think so. You might want to try and put a monitor in there and just check what the humidity is doing. You can get, so as I said, there's a training course coming up on environmental monitor control, but you can get really cheap monitors from places like Amazon. They tend to go up calibration quite quick and aren't that exact, but they do give you a rough idea of what's happening, all the way up to systems that cost thousands of pounds, and give you live data and send you a text message if your RH has gone over 65%. So there's a whole range of different ways that you can monitor the environment. And Charlotte will be talking more about that training, but if you do want to find out any more about that, please contact us. As Helen said, moth infestation, traps to monitor and see what's there, cleaning rota, and ask cleaners to get behind furniture each 2 weeks. Absolutely move furniture to avoid dark or lack of air circulation in future. Eliminate wool mixed carpet, replace with vinyl hard floor over the years. All sounds brilliant. Sue said, I think if people are informed as to why they can't touch objects, it helps to explain. So yeah, that's a good point, Sue. So I think in the National Trust, sometimes they have signs saying the acids in your fingers will harm this object, please don't touch. But I suppose it's just if you're happy to put out signage that's, I know some people can't put signage out unless it's in several languages.